Echoes of the watchtower. The sound reaches you first. The rhythmic slap of metal against water, engines growling low across the pre-dawn darkness of Iron Bottom Sound. August 7th, 1942. The first major Allied offensive in the Pacific Theater is about to begin, and 20-year-old Private Danny Miller from Toledo, Ohio, sits pressed shoulder to shoulder with 39 other Marines in the belly of a Higgins boat, watching the dark outline of Guadalcanal grow larger with each passing minute. The landing craft pitches and rolls in the choppy waters, diesel fumes mixing with salt spray and the acrid smell of fear sweat from men who've never seen combat. Miller grips his M1 Garand tighter, feeling the wood stock slick with moisture from his palms. Around him, faces are pale in the dim light filtering through the craft's open top. Some praying silently, others staring at nothing, lost in thoughts of home. What none of these young Marines fully understand yet is that they're about to step onto an island that will become synonymous with some of the most brutal jungle warfare in American military history. Guadalcanal, a name that means nothing to them now, but will echo in their nightmares for decades to come. The strategic importance of this moment cannot be overstated. For 8 months, the Japanese have been advancing virtually unchecked across the Pacific. Wake Island, Hong Kong, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, each victory extending their defensive perimeter further from the home islands. But here, on this steamy tropical island in the Solomon Chain, that tide is about to turn. The question isn't whether the Marines can establish a beachhead. Intelligence suggests the initial landing will face minimal resistance. The question is whether they can hold what they take. Miller feels the boat's engine throttle back, hears the change in pitch that means they're approaching the beach. Through the gap where the ramp will soon drop, he catches his first glimpse of Red Beach, a stretch of black volcanic sand backed by dense jungle that seems to swallow the morning light. Coconut palms sway in the humid breeze, their fronds rustling with a sound like distant applause. The irony isn't lost on the more experienced sergeants aboard these landing craft. They're using boats designed and built by Andrew Higgins in New Orleans, the same shallow draft vessels that will prove so crucial to Allied success in every theater of the war. But right now, they're simply cramped, uncomfortable boxes carrying nervous young men toward an uncertain fate. 30 seconds. The coxswain's voice cuts through the engine noise, and Miller feels his stomach drop. Not from fear, well, not entirely from fear, but from the sudden realization that everything he's trained for over the past year is about to become real. The practice landings at New River, North Carolina, the endless drills, the lectures on jungle warfare, all of it was preparation for this moment. The boat's keel scrapes against coral, then sand. The engine revs as the coxswain tries to get them as close to shore as possible. Through the hull, Miller can hear similar sounds from dozens of other landing craft. The entire 1st Marine Division, nearly 20,000 men, making their approach simultaneously along a 6-mile stretch of coastline. What strikes him most as the ramp begins to lower is the silence from the shore. No machine gun fire, no artillery, no desperate defenders rushing to meet them at the water's edge. Just the sound of waves lapping against the beach and that constant rustle of palm fronds in the breeze. It's almost peaceful, which somehow makes it more unsettling than if they'd been met with a wall of gunfire. Go, go, go! The sergeant's voice propels them forward, and suddenly Miller is splashing through knee-deep water, his equipment weighing him down, sand shifting beneath his boots as he struggles toward dry land. The water is surprisingly warm, almost bathwater temperature, and crystal clear despite being churned up by hundreds of boots and landing craft keels. Behind them, the massive shapes of transport ships dot the horizon like sleeping giants. The USS Macaulay, Admiral Turner's flagship, coordinates the complex choreography of getting men and supplies from ship to shore. Landing craft move back and forth in an endless shuttle, each trip bringing more Marines, more equipment, more ammunition for what everyone knows will be a prolonged campaign. Miller reaches the beach and immediately notices the smell. Rich, organic, almost overwhelming in its intensity. Rotting vegetation, flowering plants, and something else. Something that speaks of ancient jungle depths where sunlight never penetrates. The sand beneath his feet is unlike anything he's experienced. Black volcanic grit that seems to absorb heat and hold it, even in the early morning coolness. The tree line looms 50 yards ahead, a wall of green so dense it appears almost solid. Banyan trees with their massive root systems, coconut palms reaching toward the sky, and underneath it all, a tangle of vines and undergrowth that could hide an entire Japanese regiment. Which, for all they know, it does. But the beach remains quiet as more Marines splash ashore. Equipment follows. Ammunition boxes, radio gear, medical supplies, everything needed to sustain a division in combat thousands of miles from the nearest American base. The logistics of this operation are staggering when you consider them. Every bullet, every can of rations, every replacement part has traveled at least 3,000 miles to reach this beach. Miller's squad leader, Sergeant Rodriguez from El Paso, gestures them toward a coconut log that's been washed up on the beach. "Set up here until we get word to move inland," he says quietly. His voice carries the authority of someone who's seen combat before, probably one of the few in their unit who fought at Wake Island before its fall. As they take position behind the makeshift cover, Miller gets his first real look at the island that will be his home for the next several months. The immediate coastline is relatively narrow, maybe 100 yards of beach and scattered palm trees before the jungle proper begins. But beyond that, rising into the morning mist, are mountains. Not the gentle hills he'd expected, but serious peaks. Some reaching over 7,000 feet, their tops shrouded in clouds. The largest of these, Mount Austin, dominates the southern horizon. What Miller doesn't know yet is that those heights will become key terrain in the battles to come. The Japanese will use them as observation posts and artillery positions, turning every movement on the coastal plain into a deadly game of cat and mouse. A radio crackles somewhere nearby, and Miller catches fragments of reports from other landing zones. Beach green secure. No enemy contact at beach blue. Advancing inland per schedule. The initial phase of Operation Watchtower is proceeding exactly as planned, which in military terms usually means something is about to go very wrong. The morning sun climbs higher, burning off the coastal mist and revealing more details of their surroundings. What had seemed like pristine tropical paradise in the pre-dawn darkness now shows signs of recent Japanese occupation. A few hundred yards down the beach, Miller can see what looks like construction equipment, probably part of the Airfield project that made this island such a strategic prize. That airfield, still unfinished but already operational for fighter aircraft, represents the real reason they're here. In Japanese hands, it would give enemy bombers the range to threaten Australia and New Zealand. In American hands, it becomes a stepping stone toward the Japanese home islands. The stakes couldn't be higher, even though most of the Marines splashing ashore this morning don't fully grasp the strategic implications. Rodriguez checks his watch and scans the tree line through binoculars. "Too quiet," he mutters, more to himself than to his squad. Way too quiet for a place that's supposed to be defended. Miller follows his gaze toward the jungle wall, trying to spot any sign of movement, any glint of metal that might betray a hidden position. But the green mass reveals nothing. Birds call from the depths, unfamiliar sounds that seem almost prehistoric. Somewhere in the distance, a monkey chatters, then falls silent. The truth, which won't become clear until later, is that most of the Japanese garrison has withdrawn inland to more defensible positions. The initial landing is meeting no resistance because the enemy commander has decided not to contest the beaches. It's a sound tactical decision that will make the Marines' immediate task easier, while setting up far more difficult challenges in the days ahead. As more equipment comes ashore and the beachhead expands, Miller begins to understand the scale of what they've undertaken. This isn't a raid or a quick strike. The massive amount of supplies, the construction equipment already being unloaded, the engineering units setting up communication lines, all of it points to a long-term occupation. The morning breeze carries new scents from the jungle, flowers he can't identify, the green smell of growing things, and underneath it all, something that might be smoke from cooking fires deeper inland. The island isn't empty. Someone is watching them, waiting, making plans of their own. Henderson Field's shadow. The reality of their situation becomes clearer with each passing hour. Miller watches the engineers work with an urgency that speaks volumes. Bulldozers pushing through palm groves, survey teams marking elevations, communication specialists stringing wire between hastily erected poles. This isn't just about taking ground, it's about holding it. The airfield sits like a raw wound carved into the jungle, a strip of red earth stretching nearly 4,500 feet through what was, just days ago, untouched tropical forest. The Japanese had been building it themselves. Concrete mixers abandoned mid-pour, construction equipment left where it stood when the workers fled inland. Now American engineers swarm over the half-finished runway, racing to complete what their enemies had started. Miller's squad draws perimeter duty on the second day, positioned where the jungle meets the cleared approaches to the field. The work never stops. Even in the oppressive heat of midday, when the metal of his rifle becomes too hot to touch comfortably, the sound of construction echoes across the island. Hammering, sawing, the growl of heavy machinery, and underneath it all, the constant buzz of radio chatter, coordinating the controlled chaos of turning a beachhead into a base. "They'll come for this," Sergeant Hayes tells them during a brief rest, nodding toward the airfield. "Mark my words, whatever else happens here, they'll come for that strip of dirt." The sergeant understands something that Miller is only beginning to grasp. Henderson Field, named for a Marine pilot killed at Midway just 2 months earlier, represents more than tactical convenience. It's a dagger pointed at the heart of Japanese supply lines. From here, American aircraft can reach the major enemy base at Rabaul. They can interdict shipping moving through the slot, that narrow passage between the Solomon Islands that serves as Japan's highway to their southern conquests. Which means the Japanese will do everything in their power to take it back. The first air raid comes on the third day, announced by the wail of sirens that sends everyone scrambling for foxholes and slit trenches. Miller presses himself into the red earth, feeling the vibration of aircraft engines through the ground before he hears them. When he finally risks a look skyward, he sees them, twin-engine bombers in tight formation, their rising sun markings clearly visible against the tropical sky. The anti-aircraft guns open up with a sound like thunder, filling the air with black puffs of smoke. But the bombers press their attack, and Miller watches bombs tumble from their bellies like deadly rain. The explosions march across the airfield in a line of fire and flying debris, each detonation sending up geysers of red dirt and shattered palm fronds. It lasts perhaps 10 minutes. When the all-clear sounds and they emerge from their holes, Miller sees the damage. Craters pocking the runway, one of the fuel dumps burning with thick black smoke, several men being carried toward the aid station. But the airfield is still operational. Within an hour, work crews are filling the bomb craters and the construction noise resumes. "This is just the beginning," Hayes says quietly, watching the smoke rise from the burning fuel. "They're testing us, seeing what we've got, how fast we can repair damage. The real show hasn't started yet." By evening, the character of Henderson Field begins to emerge. It's a rough, improvised place, nothing like the established bases back in Australia or Hawaii. Aircraft parking areas consist of dirt hardstands carved from the jungle. Maintenance is performed in the open, mechanics working by lamplight to keep the growing collection of fighters and dive bombers operational. Miller walks the perimeter as dusk settles over the island, the jungle around them alive with sounds he's learning to identify. The call of fruit bats emerging for their nightly hunt, the rustle of palm fronds in the evening breeze, and occasionally sounds that make him grip his rifle tighter. The crack of a branch breaking under weight that might be human, the whisper of movement through undergrowth just beyond the range of vision. The airfield spreads before him in the gathering darkness, a scene that would be almost peaceful if not for the circumstances. P-39 Airacobras and F-4F Wildcats sit in irregular rows, their propellers still and their cockpits covered against the tropical moisture. Ground crews move among them like shadows, checking fuel levels, loading ammunition, preparing for whatever tomorrow might bring. The pilots, most of them barely older than Miller himself, gather around a makeshift operations tent, studying maps and weather reports by the light of kerosene lanterns. Their faces show the strain of constant readiness. They know that when the next air raid siren sounds, they'll have perhaps 5 minutes to get airborne before the enemy bombers arrive overhead. Cactus Air Force, someone has dubbed this collection of Marine, Navy, and Army pilots thrown together by necessity. The radio call sign for Henderson Field is cactus, and the name fits. Like the desert plant, they're learning to survive in harsh conditions with minimal resources. Miller overhears fragments of their conversations as he passes. Discussions of fuel mixtures in the tropical heat, the challenge of maintaining aircraft without proper spare parts, the difficulty of coordinating with ships offshore when radio communications are spotty at best. These men are writing the manual for Pacific air operations as they go, learning through trial and error what works and what gets you killed. The jungle presses close on all sides, a wall of green that seems to absorb sound and movement. Intelligence reports suggest several thousand Japanese troops have withdrawn inland, regrouping and preparing for a counterattack. But where exactly, and when? The questions hang in the humid air, like the smoke from the cooking fires that dot the American perimeter. As full darkness settles over Guadalcanal, Miller begins to understand the rhythm that will govern their lives here. Days belong to construction and preparation, strengthening defenses, extending the runway, stockpiling supplies. But nights belong to uncertainty. The Japanese own the waters around the island after dark. American naval forces withdraw each evening, unable to risk their ships in the confined waters of what's becoming known as Iron Bottom Sound. This leaves the Marines and soldiers on Guadalcanal isolated from sunset to sunrise, dependent on whatever supplies and reinforcements can be delivered during daylight hours. Tokyo Express, the intelligence briefings call it, Japanese destroyers and cruisers that race down the slot under cover of darkness, bombard American positions, and disappear before dawn. Fast ships carrying troops and supplies to Japanese forces still holding positions throughout the Solomon Islands, a supply line that operates in reverse of normal naval doctrine, using warships as cargo vessels because they're the only vessels fast enough to make the round trip in a single night. Miller doesn't yet know the term, but he can sense the implications. The distant rumble of ship engines in the darkness, the occasional flash of gunfire on the horizon, the knowledge that somewhere out there, enemy forces are moving and planning, while the Americans hunker down and wait for morning. The airfield represents their best hope of changing this equation. Once Henderson Field is fully operational, American aircraft can patrol the slot during daylight hours, making Japanese supply runs far more dangerous. But that assumes they can hold the field against whatever counterattack is coming. Standing in the darkness at the edge of the jungle, Miller listens to the sounds of the night. Somewhere in that green maze, Japanese forces are watching and waiting. They know this island better than any American. They've had months to prepare positions, cache supplies, study the terrain. When they're ready to move, they'll have every advantage except one. The Americans aren't leaving. The construction noise has finally died away, replaced by the quieter sounds of a military base settling into evening routine. Sentries calling out challenges and passwords, the distant murmur of radio communications, the soft clink of equipment being cleaned and checked one more time before sleep. Miller thinks about the letters from home in his pack, still unread. News from a world that seems impossibly distant from this place, where the jungle meets the sea and every dawn might bring enemy bombers overhead. He'll read them later when there's time to process words from people who can't imagine what Henderson Field looks like in the tropical darkness, or what it means to fall asleep to the sound of distant engines that might be friendly, or might not. For now, there's only the immediate reality, the weight of his rifle, the red dirt under his boots, the knowledge that somewhere in the darkness, other young men are making plans that will determine whether Henderson Field remains in American hands when the sun rises again. The war in the Pacific has found its fulcrum point on this obscure island, though none of them fully understand it yet. In the months to come, Henderson Field will be the prize that draws Japanese and American forces into a grinding battle of attrition that will help determine the outcome of the entire Pacific campaign. But tonight, it's simply a dirt strip carved from the jungle, defended by young men a long way from home, waiting to see what tomorrow will bring. Jungle's embrace. The jungle beyond Henderson Field swallows sound like a living thing. 3 days after the initial landing, Private Miller finds himself part of a 6-man patrol moving through vegetation so dense that visibility extends barely 10 yards in any direction. The canopy overhead forms an almost impenetrable ceiling, allowing only scattered coins of sunlight to reach the forest floor below. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez leads them single file along what might generously be called a trail, though it's little more than a depression in the undergrowth where native feet have passed for generations. The Marines have learned to move differently here than they did in training at Camp Lejeune. Every step must be deliberate. Every branch that catches on equipment creates noise that could betray their position to Japanese forces known to be operating in the area. The heat is unlike anything Miller experienced during summer maneuvers in North Carolina. It's a living, breathing presence that wraps around them like wet wool. Within minutes of leaving the relative openness of the airfield perimeter, his dungarees are soaked through with perspiration. The humidity approaches 100%. Moisture hangs in the air so thick it seems almost drinkable. But it's the sounds that unnerve him most. The jungle is never truly quiet. Insects buzz and click in frequencies that seem to bypass the ears and vibrate directly in the skull. Somewhere above, invisible birds call to each other in harsh, alien voices. Occasionally, something larger moves through the canopy, sending a cascade of leaves and small branches to the forest floor below. Rodriguez holds up his fist, bringing the patrol to an immediate halt. Miller freezes mid-step, his M1 Garand at the ready. They wait, listening. The sergeant's experience in Nicaragua during the Banana Wars has given him an almost supernatural ability to read the jungle's moods. After 30 seconds that feel like 30 minutes, he signals them forward again. The terrain itself seems designed to exhaust and demoralize. What appears to be solid ground often gives way to hidden streams or patches of sucking mud that can swallow a boot to the ankle. Fallen logs, some as thick as telephone poles, block their path at irregular intervals. The choice becomes whether to climb over, exposing themselves above the surrounding vegetation, or to find a way around that might lead them into areas where the enemy could be waiting. Vines hang everywhere like nature's own barbed wire. Some are thin as fishing line, but strong enough to trip a man carrying 60 pounds of equipment. Others are thick as a man's wrist, creating natural barriers that must be cut through with machetes, each blade stroke echoing through the green cathedral around them. Miller notices how the jungle changes a man's relationship with his rifle. In the open country of training exercises, the Garand felt like an extension of his body, a familiar tool perfectly suited to its purpose. Here it becomes an awkward burden that catches on every branch and vine. Yet simultaneously, it's the most precious thing he possesses, his only reliable means of survival in this alien environment. The patrol has been moving for 2 hours when they encounter their first significant obstacle. A stream, perhaps 15 feet wide, cuts across their intended route. The water runs dark and silent, its depth impossible to judge from the surface. More concerning are the reports they've received about Japanese positions along waterways, natural choke points where a small force can control the movement of much larger units. Rodriguez studies the stream for several minutes, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. Finally, he signals for Corporal Washington to move upstream about 50 yards, while Private Kowalski moves downstream an equal distance. They'll cross at 3 points simultaneously, reducing the time any one Marine spends exposed in the open water. Miller finds himself assigned to cross with Rodriguez at the center point. The water is surprisingly cool against his legs as he wades in, a momentary relief from the oppressive heat. But relief quickly turns to anxiety as the stream bottom proves treacherous. Smooth rocks shift underfoot, and more than once he nearly loses his balance, trying to keep his rifle and ammunition dry. Halfway across, Rodriguez freezes again. This time, Miller hears it too, the unmistakable sound of human voices somewhere downstream. Japanese voices, speaking in low, urgent tones. The distance makes it impossible to determine exact numbers, but the very presence of enemy forces in their immediate area transforms the jungle from merely hostile to actively dangerous. They complete their crossing in absolute silence and regroup on the far bank. Rodriguez makes a series of hand signals that Miller has learned to read like a second language. Enemy contact possible, maintain noise discipline, prepare for immediate action. The patrol adjusts its formation slightly, spreading out enough to avoid being caught in a single burst of gunfire, but staying close enough to provide mutual support. The next hour passes with agonizing slowness. Every shadow could conceal an enemy soldier. Every unusual sound might be the prelude to an ambush. Miller finds his senses heightened to an almost painful degree, his eyes constantly scanning the vegetation ahead and to both sides, his ears straining to separate natural jungle sounds from anything that might indicate human presence. They discover the first signs of recent Japanese activity near what appears to be an abandoned native village. Gardens that were once carefully tended now grow wild, but the banana plants and coconut palms still bear fruit. More significantly, they find evidence of recent campfires and food preparation, rice grains scattered near a fire pit that couldn't be more than a day old. Rodriguez calls in their position using the SCR-300 radio that Private Murphy has been carrying like a 30-pound anchor through the jungle. The transmission is necessarily brief. Long radio communications can be intercepted and used for direction finding by enemy forces. But headquarters needs to know that Japanese units are operating this far from their suspected positions. The response crackles back through static and atmospheric interference. Continue patrol as planned. Report any significant enemy contact immediately. Expect possible reinforcement of your area within 24 hours. The words offer little comfort when filtered through the green maze surrounding them. As afternoon wears toward evening, the jungle's character begins to shift subtly. The quality of light filtering through the canopy takes on a different hue, more golden, less harsh, but with the approaching darkness comes a new set of concerns. Night operations in this terrain would be virtually impossible, yet remaining stationary makes them vulnerable to enemy forces that might have better knowledge of local conditions. Rodriguez makes the tactical decision to establish a temporary observation post on a slight rise that offers marginally better visibility of the surrounding area. It's not ideal. Nowhere in this jungle could be called ideal, but it provides some advantage over the low ground where water collects and movement becomes even more restricted. They dig in using entrenching tools that seem pitifully inadequate against the root-choked soil. Every scrape of metal against earth sounds thunderous in the humid air. But the work must be done. Shallow fighting positions that might provide some protection if they're discovered before they can withdraw to more defensible terrain. Miller finds himself thinking about Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, whose reputation has preceded him to Guadalcanal. The stories circulate through the ranks like currency. Puller's exploits in Nicaragua, his ability to outthink and outfight guerrilla forces in terrain not unlike what they're experiencing now. The men take comfort in knowing that leaders like Puller understand jungle warfare, that the tactics being developed aren't simply theoretical exercises, but proven methods adapted from real combat experience. The insects become more aggressive as the day wanes. Mosquitoes rise from every pool of standing water like miniature air raids. The repellent they've been issued provides some protection, but its effectiveness seems to diminish in the face of such overwhelming numbers. More concerning are the larger insects. Some species entirely unknown to men, raised in American cities and farms. Disease represents a threat as real as enemy bullets in this environment. Malaria, dengue fever, and a dozen other tropical ailments can remove a man from combat as effectively as any wound. The medical corpsmen have briefed them extensively on prevention, but theory becomes much more difficult to implement when every source of water might be contaminated and every insect bite could be the vector for serious illness. As darkness approaches, the patrol prepares for what will likely be a sleepless night. They've established fields of fire as best they can in the limited visibility, and arranged their positions to provide mutual support. But ultimately, their security depends more on remaining undetected than on their ability to fight off a determined attack in this terrain. The jungle night brings its own symphony of sounds, different from the daytime chorus but equally alien to American ears. Somewhere in the distance, a nightbird calls with a voice like rusty hinges. Closer at hand, something moves through the underbrush with deliberate, measured steps. Too large to be a bird, too quiet to be a wild pig. Miller checks his rifle for perhaps the 20th time today, ensuring that moisture hasn't affected the mechanism, that his ammunition is secure and accessible. In a few hours, the sun will rise on another day of this strange green war, another day of moving through terrain that seems designed to test every aspect of human endurance. The strategic importance of their mission extends far beyond this single patrol. Every piece of intelligence they gather about Japanese positions and movements contributes to a larger understanding of enemy capabilities on Guadalcanal. The information will help determine where to concentrate defensive efforts around Henderson Field and where opportunities might exist for offensive operations. But for now, in this small clearing carved from the jungle's embrace, 6 Marines settle in to wait for dawn, each man alone with his thoughts despite the proximity of his fellow soldiers, each understanding that survival depends as much on the jungle's cooperation as on their own skill and courage. The war has found them here, in this green maze half a world from home, and they will meet it as Marines have always met the unknown, with steady nerves and ready weapons. Whispers in the dark. The first night watch begins at 2200 hours, and with it comes an education in solitude that no training manual could have prepared them for. Miller draws the midnight to 0400 shift, 4 hours that will stretch like an eternity in the darkness. He settles into the shallow scrape he's carved from the jungle floor, rifle across his knees, eyes adjusting slowly to the maze of shadows that surrounds their small perimeter. The jungle at night is a living thing, breathing, whispering, moving with subtle rhythms that speak of creatures unseen and dangers unquantified. Every rustle of leaves might be wind, or it might be a Japanese infiltrator moving through the undergrowth with practiced silence. Every snap of a twig could signal the approach of an enemy patrol, or simply the passage of some nocturnal animal going about its ancient business. This uncertainty, this constant state of heightened alertness, becomes the defining characteristic of jungle warfare. The human nervous system, evolved for brief moments of crisis followed by recovery, finds itself locked in perpetual vigilance. Hour after hour, night after night, the body's stress response floods the system with adrenaline that has nowhere to go. Miller listens to the symphony of the tropical night, a complex layering of sounds that gradually becomes as familiar as his own heartbeat. The distant call of night birds, the rustle of fruit bats in the canopy overhead, the soft scurrying of small mammals through the leaf litter. Each sound must be catalogued, identified, filed away as normal or investigated as potentially threatening. The strategic reality of their situation weighs heavily in these quiet hours. Guadalcanal represents the first time American forces have gone on the offensive in the Pacific, but that offensive depends entirely on their ability to hold what they've taken. Every night, Japanese destroyers race down from Rabaul in what the Americans are already calling the Tokyo Express, bringing reinforcements and supplies to enemy forces gathering in the jungle around them. The mathematics of their isolation are stark. Henderson Field, still under construction, can barely handle the aircraft needed to provide air cover during daylight hours. But when darkness falls, the Japanese Navy owns these waters. American supply ships must withdraw or risk destruction, leaving the Marines to face whatever the night might bring, with only the ammunition and rations they've managed to stockpile during precious daylight hours. Miller shifts position carefully, mindful that even small movements might give away his location to enemy observers. The foxhole he's scraped from the earth is barely deep enough to provide cover, but digging deeper would have required tools they don't possess and time they couldn't spare. Like everything else in this campaign, it represents a compromise between the ideal and the possible. The weight of responsibility settles on his shoulders like a physical burden. 6 men sleep fitfully behind him, trusting that his eyes and ears will provide the early warning that might mean the difference between life and death. This trust, freely given between men who knew each other only as names on a roster just weeks ago, represents one of the profound transformations that combat brings to human relationships. In the darkness, rank matters less than reliability. The 19-year-old private from Iowa, whose hands shake when he lights a cigarette, might prove steadier under fire than the veteran sergeant who talks a good game. The quiet kid from Oregon, who barely speaks during the day, might possess the kind of night vision and forest sense that keeps an entire squad alive. War has a way of revealing character. Stripping away pretense to expose the essential qualities that matter when everything is at stake. A sound catches Miller's attention, different from the familiar pattern of jungle noise. He freezes, every muscle tense, straining to isolate and identify what his subconscious has flagged as potentially significant. There, again, a soft metallic click that doesn't belong to the natural soundscape around him. The seconds stretch into minutes as he waits, listening, Watching the shadows for any hint of movement, his finger finds the safety of his rifle, thumb ready to flick it to fire if needed. But he doesn't move otherwise, doesn't shift position or crane his neck for a better view. Movement draws the eye, and if there are enemy soldiers out there in the darkness, sudden motion might trigger the very confrontation he's hoping to avoid. This is the paradox of night watch in hostile territory. The need to be simultaneously hyper-vigilant and perfectly still, ready for instant action while maintaining absolute discipline. It's a skill that can't be taught in training camps back in the States, only learned through nights like this, when the cost of a mistake might be measured in American lives. The sound doesn't repeat. After 20 minutes of careful observation, Miller allows himself to relax slightly, filing the incident away as probably nothing, but remaining alert for any recurrence. This is how nights pass in the jungle, a series of small mysteries and false alarms that keep the nervous system on edge and sleep forever, just beyond reach. Around 0300 hours, the darkest time of night, exhaustion begins to wage war with vigilance. Miller's eyelids grow heavy despite his best efforts to stay alert. He employs the techniques every sentry learns, shifting position regularly, focusing on different sectors of his assigned field of observation, running through mental exercises that keep his mind engaged with his surroundings. The loneliness of these hours cuts deeper than physical discomfort. Back home, 0300 means the deepest part of sleep, warm beds and familiar rooms, the comfort of routine and safety. Here, it means the halfway point of a watch that seems to stretch toward a dawn that might never come. The distance between this jungle clearing and everything that once defined normal life feels measured not in miles, but in lifetimes. Letters from home, when they arrive, speak of harvests and high school football games, of rationing and victory gardens, of a home front that supports the war effort but continues to function within recognizable patterns of civilian life. These glimpses of normalcy feel simultaneously precious and alien, reminders of a world that seems increasingly difficult to believe in. But it's precisely this contrast, this awareness of what they're fighting to preserve, that gives meaning to nights like this. Every hour of vigilance in this jungle clearing represents an investment in the possibility that someday, American families will sleep safely in their beds without wondering whether enemy forces might be gathering in the darkness beyond their windows. The strategic significance of Guadalcanal extends far beyond its immediate tactical value. This campaign represents a test of American resolve, the first real measure of whether the industrial democracy of the United States can produce not just the weapons of war, but the warriors capable of using them effectively in the most challenging conditions imaginable. As 0400 approaches, Miller prepares to wake his replacement, another Marine who will spend the next 4 hours staring into the same shadows, listening to the same mysterious sounds, carrying the same weight of responsibility for sleeping comrades. The watch will pass from man to man, night after night, until either the mission is complete or the jungle claims them all. But for now, in these final minutes of his vigil, Miller allows himself a moment of quiet pride. He has held his post, maintained his discipline, kept faith with the men who trusted him with their lives. It's a small victory in a vast war, but it's his victory, earned through hours of patient vigilance and steady nerves. The jungle around him continues its ancient rhythms, indifferent to human conflict, eternal in its cycles of growth and decay. But tonight, this small piece of it belongs to the United States Marine Corps, held by young men who understand that freedom's price is often paid in lonely hours. In the darkness, far from home, dawn is still hours away, but Miller has brought his small piece of the perimeter safely through another night, one watch at a time, one Marine at a time, one act of courage building upon another until they form the foundation of victory itself. Moments of respite. The first hint of dawn arrives not as light, but as sound, the distant rumble of aircraft engines growing stronger with each passing minute. Miller looks up through the canopy, squinting at patches of sky barely visible between the leaves. C-47 transport planes, their steady drone a welcome contrast to the sharp whine of Japanese fighters they've grown accustomed to hearing. "Supply drop," whispers Corporal Hayes, materializing beside Miller's position like a ghost. The older Marine's face shows the strain of weeks in the jungle, but his eyes hold something Miller hasn't seen in days. Hope. The parachutes bloom against the morning sky like enormous white flowers, drifting down through shafts of sunlight that pierce the jungle canopy. Crates of ammunition, medical supplies, and most precious of all, mail from home. The Marines emerge from their positions, moving with practiced caution but unmistakable eagerness toward the landing zones. Miller helps drag a heavy crate through the undergrowth, its contents rattling with the promise of resupply. But it's the canvas mail sack that draws the longest looks, the most careful handling, letters from wives, mothers, sweethearts, fragments of a world that seems impossibly distant from this green hell. Back at their temporary position, the squad gathers in a loose circle. Sergeant Rodriguez distributes the mail with ceremonial precision, each name called out like a small victory. Miller receives 2 letters, one from his mother in Iowa, another from his younger brother who's working in a defense plant in Detroit. He doesn't read them immediately. Instead, he watches his fellow Marines, studying their faces as they absorb news from home. Private Thompson from Georgia grins at something his girlfriend has written, while Corporal Martinez from New Mexico folds his letter carefully, his expression unreadable. The sharing begins naturally, as it always does. Thompson reads aloud a passage about his girl's new job at the local USO, how she's learning to dance with soldiers on leave. Martinez mentions that his father's crops are doing well, that the family is managing without him. Small details, ordinary life continuing in their absence. Miller finally opens his mother's letter, her familiar handwriting bringing the scent of her kitchen, the sound of wind through Iowa cornfields. She writes about the Victory Garden, about rationing sugar for his father's coffee, about how the neighbor's boy came home on leave and looked so grown up in his army uniform. His brother's letter carries a different energy, excitement about the B-24 bombers rolling off the assembly line where he works, pride in contributing to the war effort, questions about what it's really like out here. Miller finds himself smiling at his brother's enthusiasm, remembering his own eagerness before he understood what combat actually meant. The afternoon brings an unexpected gift, a lull in operations that allows for something approaching rest. The Marines establish a defensive perimeter, but for once, the immediate threat feels manageable. Some clean their weapons with unusual care, others attempt to wash uniforms in a nearby stream. Miller finds himself paired with Hayes for watch duty, the veteran Marine proving unexpectedly talkative as they scan the jungle approaches. Hayes speaks quietly about his wife in San Diego, how they met at a USO dance, how she writes him letters every day, even though mail delivery is so irregular. She sends me pictures sometimes, Hayes says, pulling a worn photograph from his breast pocket. This one's from last month, her sister's wedding. The image shows a young woman in a blue dress, smiling at the camera with genuine warmth. She looks happy, Miller observes, and Hayes nods with quiet satisfaction. The conversation turns to plans, to what comes after the war. Hayes wants to use his GI benefits to study engineering, maybe work on the big construction projects he's heard are coming. Miller talks about returning to the farm, about applying new organizational skills he's learned in the Marines to agricultural problems. As evening approaches, the squad gathers again, this time around a small fire carefully concealed from observation. Someone has managed to brew actual coffee, not the bitter substitute they've been drinking for weeks. The hot liquid tastes like civilization, like normalcy temporarily restored. Private Chen produces a harmonica, playing soft melodies that drift through the jungle air. Moonlight Serenade, I'll Be Seeing You, songs that carry them home without moving a single step. Other Marines hum along quietly, their voices blending with the evening sounds of the jungle. Rodriguez shares stories from his time in Nicaragua, comparing jungle conditions, offering practical advice about foot care and equipment maintenance. His experience becomes a bridge between their current hardships and the possibility of survival, of eventual victory. The mail brings news of the wider war, snippets from newspapers included in care packages, the fighting in North Africa, Russian resistance on the Eastern Front, production numbers from American factories. They begin to understand their place in something vast, their small corner of the Pacific connected to a global struggle. Miller writes his own letters by firelight, choosing words carefully, balancing honesty with reassurance. He tells his mother about the beauty of Pacific sunsets, about friendships forged under difficult circumstances, about feeling proud to serve. He doesn't mention the fear, the sleepless nights, the constant awareness of mortality. To his brother, he writes differently, acknowledging the seriousness of their situation while emphasizing the importance of the work being done at home. Every bomber, every shell, every piece of equipment matters out here. The connection between factory and foxhole has never been clearer. As the fire burns lower, the Marines begin settling into their positions for another night. But something has changed. Some essential burden temporarily lightened. They remain alert, professional, ready for whatever the darkness might bring. Yet tonight they carry something extra. Reminders of home, connections to the world they're fighting to preserve, evidence that they are not forgotten in this distant jungle. The letters will be read again, the photographs studied, the memories carefully preserved against the hardships still to come. The supply drop brought more than material goods. It brought hope, connection, the promise that this isolation is temporary, that the long chain of supply and communication stretching across the Pacific remains unbroken, linking them to everything they left behind. The island's soul, as the Marines settled into their routines around Henderson Field, the island itself bore witness to changes that ran deeper than military strategy. For generations before the first transport ships appeared on the horizon, Guadalcanal had been home to people who knew every stream, every ridge, every hidden path through the jungle canopy. The Melanesian villagers had watched the Japanese arrive first, bringing their own strange machinery and urgent construction projects. Now they observed these Americans, with their different uniforms, different language, but the same desperate energy of men far from home. The islanders moved quietly through their transformed landscape, adapting as they had always adapted, finding ways to survive while empires clashed around them. In the villages beyond the perimeter, life continued with careful resilience. Women still tended gardens of taro and sweet potato, though now they listened constantly for the drone of aircraft engines. Children still played along the beaches, but they had learned to recognize the difference between friendly and enemy formations approaching from the sea. The elders spoke in hushed tones of omens and changes, of how the spirits of the ancestors might view this upheaval in their ancient domain. Some islanders served as guides for American patrols, their knowledge of jungle paths proving invaluable to Marines like Miller, who struggled to read the dense green maze. They moved with an economy of motion that spoke of generations spent navigating this terrain, stepping surely where the Americans stumbled, reading signs in broken vegetation and disturbed earth that revealed the passage of Japanese forces hours earlier. The island's natural rhythms persisted beneath the chaos of war. Morning mists still rose from the valleys, carrying the scent of orchids and decomposing leaves. Fruit bats still emerged at dusk, their leathery wings cutting silhouettes against the orange sky. Even as tracer rounds occasionally streaked through the same airspace, the jungle continued its ancient work of growth and decay. Vines slowly reclaiming abandoned positions, rain washing away the scars of shellfire. Near an abandoned native settlement, a Marine's empty mess kit sat forgotten on a fallen log. The dented metal reflected fragments of sunlight filtering through the canopy above, while leaves and twigs had already begun to accumulate around its edges. Nature was patient, persistent, ready to reclaim everything that men had brought to this place. When the time came for them to move on, the islanders understood this impermanence in ways the foreign soldiers could not. They had seen other changes, other disruptions, and had learned that the island itself endured while human conflicts passed like violent storms. Their quiet presence served as a reminder that this land had its own history, its own claim to dignity, independent of the strategic objectives that brought young men like Miller to fight and die in its jungles. In the evenings, when the artillery fell silent and only insects filled the air with their ancient chorus, it was possible to sense the island's deeper identity. This was more than a battleground, more than coordinates on a military map. It was home to people who had loved this soil for centuries, who would remain long after the last transport ship disappeared over the horizon, carrying its cargo of survivors back to distant shores they called home. The island remembered everything, and forgave nothing, and endured. Whispers of steel, the island remembered. But the sea around it spoke in thunder. Miller had learned to distinguish the sounds by now, the deep, rolling percussion of naval gunfire from destroyers, the earth-shaking roar of battleship salvos that could be felt in his chest cavity even miles inland. Night after night, the waters around Guadalcanal became an arena where steel leviathans sought each other in darkness. From Henderson Field, he would watch the horizon light up with muzzle flashes, brief, brilliant stars that bloomed and died in seconds. The sound would reach them later, a rumbling that seemed to come from the ocean floor itself. These were the battles that would earn names: Savo Island, Cape Esperance, the naval battle of Guadalcanal, but to Miller and his squad, they were simply the sounds that meant supplies might, or might not, reach them in the morning. The strategic calculus was brutal in its simplicity. Control the sea lanes during daylight, and you could resupply Henderson Field. Lose them, and the Marines would slowly starve, their ammunition dwindling, their ability to hold the airfield measured in days rather than weeks. Admiral Halsey understood this arithmetic of survival. Every destroyer that limped back to port damaged. Every cruiser that failed to return from the night battles represented not just tonnage lost, but meals that wouldn't reach Marine mess tents, aviation fuel that wouldn't power the Wildcats and Dauntlesses operating from Henderson's scarred runway. Miller watched those aircraft with something approaching reverence. The Grumman Wildcats would lumber down the steel matting of the airstrip, their engines coughing to life in the pre-dawn darkness, pilots barely visible in their cockpits. These men were fighting a different kind of war, one measured in fuel consumption and ammunition loads, in the precise calculations needed to intercept Japanese bombers approaching from Rabaul. The Wildcat wasn't the most elegant fighter aircraft, not the fastest or most maneuverable, but it was robust, dependable, capable of absorbing punishment and bringing its pilot home. Miller had seen them return with fabric hanging in strips, with bullet holes stitched across their wings, engines smoking and landing gear damaged. Each takeoff was an act of faith, each landing a small miracle. The pilots rarely spoke to the ground troops. Different worlds, different wars, but Miller understood their burden. Every morning, they climbed into machines that might not bring them back, to fight an enemy whose Zero fighters were faster, more agile, whose pilots had been honing their skills since the war in China. The strategic picture was becoming clearer, even to a Marine private. Guadalcanal wasn't just about holding an airfield, it was about proving that American forces could take ground from the Japanese, could hold it, could build something lasting from the chaos of amphibious assault. Every night battle in the waters offshore, every dawn patrol launched from Henderson Field, every supply run that made it through the gauntlet of enemy submarines, these were the threads from which victory would be woven. Miller began to understand his place in this vast machinery of war, not just as a rifleman, not just as another body holding a defensive perimeter, but as part of something larger, a proof of concept, a demonstration that the long road back across the Pacific was possible. The island endured, and slowly, methodically, the Americans were learning to endure with it. Guadalcanal's lullaby. The months passed like pages turning in a waterlogged journal, each day bleeding into the next through monsoon rains and scorching heat, through the thunder of naval guns offshore and the whisper of jungle winds through Henderson Field's makeshift hangars. Miller had learned to measure time not in weeks or months, but in supply drops survived, in patrols completed, in letters from home that arrived sporadically like gifts from another world entirely. By January of 1943, something had shifted in the rhythm of the campaign. The Tokyo Express runs had grown less frequent, the Japanese air raids more desperate and poorly coordinated. Intelligence reports filtered down through the chain of command spoke of enemy supply shortages, of units reduced to eating grass and tree bark, of a strategic withdrawal being planned under the cover of what the Japanese command would later call a tactical repositioning. Miller stood on the beach one evening, watching the sunset paint the waters of Iron Bottom Sound in shades of amber and rose gold. and realized he could no longer hear the distant rumble of enemy artillery that had been the island's constant heartbeat for so many months. The silence felt almost unnatural, like the moment after a thunderstorm when the world holds its breath before resuming its normal cadence. The final Japanese evacuation came not with the dramatic clash of armies that Hollywood would later imagine, but with the subtle efficiency of a military machine recognizing the inevitable mathematics of logistics and attrition. On the nights of February 1st through 7th, destroyers and submarines slipped through the darkness to extract what remained of the once proud garrison that had held the island's interior for 6 grinding months. Miller's squad was positioned along the coastal observation posts during those final nights, watching the distant silhouettes of enemy vessels moving like ghosts across the moonlit waters. There was something almost melancholy about it. These ships that had brought death and terror for so long, now serving as lifelines for a defeated force seeking only to escape the jungle that had become their prison. When dawn broke on February 9th and the patrols ventured inland to find abandoned positions and empty supply caches, Miller felt not the surge of triumph he had expected, but rather a profound exhaustion that seemed to settle into his bones like the island's perpetual humidity. Victory, he discovered, tasted less like celebration and more like the simple relief of drawing breath after holding it for too long. The island began its slow transformation back towards something resembling peace. Henderson Field, once a desperate outpost clinging to existence between air raids, evolved into a major staging base for the campaigns that would follow. Bougainville, the Marshalls, the Long Island hopping advance toward Japan itself. But for Miller and the men of the 1st Marine Division, Guadalcanal had served its purpose as both battleground and classroom. They had learned that modern warfare in the Pacific would be fought not just with rifles and artillery, but with supply lines stretching across thousands of miles of ocean, with air superiority measured in sorties per day rather than individual dogfights, with intelligence networks that could predict enemy movements weeks in advance. They had discovered that victory belonged not to the most courageous or the most skilled, but to the side that could sustain its logistics longest while adapting most quickly to the unique demands of jungle warfare. The Melanesian guides who had served with American forces began to emerge from the shadows of military necessity. Their knowledge of the island's hidden paths and seasonal rhythms no longer critical for tactical advantage, but valuable now for the slower work of reconstruction and reconciliation. They moved through the former battlefields with the quiet dignity of people reclaiming their ancestral home, pointing out where fruit trees had been damaged by artillery and would need replanting, where streams had been polluted by fuel spills and required careful restoration. As the weeks passed and replacement units arrived to garrison the island, Miller found himself walking the same jungle paths he had once patrolled with rifle ready and senses hyper-alert. Now he moved with the relaxed gait of a tourist, noting the way morning light filtered through the canopy in golden columns, listening to the bird calls that had been masked for so long by the sounds of war, watching butterflies dance through clearings where machine gun nests had once commanded fields of fire. The monsoon rains that had once seemed like additional enemies now became simply weather, washing the island clean of cordite residue and the metallic taste of fear that had lingered in the air for months. Miller would sit in his tent during the evening downpours, listening to the steady drumbeat of water on canvas and remembering how that same sound had once made him grip his rifle tighter, expecting enemy infiltrators to use the noise as cover for night attacks that would never come again. On his final evening before the division's departure for Australia and rest, Miller returned to the beach where they had made their unopposed landing 8 months earlier. The same waves rolled against the same coral sand, but everything else had changed in ways both visible and invisible. Henderson Field's runway lights stretched inland like a constellation brought down to earth. Supply depots and communication centers sprawled where once there had been only jungle, and the sound of aircraft engines had become as natural as the evening chorus of insects and tree frogs. He thought about the letters he would write home, trying to explain not the dramatic moments of combat that would make the newsreels, but the quieter lessons of endurance and adaptation. The discovery that courage was less about heroic gestures and more about the daily choice to continue functioning when every instinct screamed for rest. The understanding that victory in modern warfare belonged to the side that could learn fastest from its mistakes while maintaining the industrial capacity to implement those lessons on a massive scale. As darkness settled over Guadalcanal for another night, Miller lay back on the sand and listened to the island's ancient lullaby. The whisper of trade winds through palm fronds, the gentle percussion of waves against coral, the distant calls of night birds resuming their eternal conversations, all blending together into the timeless rhythm that had soothed this corner of the Pacific long before men arrived with their wars and would continue long after they departed, carrying with them the knowledge that sometimes the most important victories are measured not in territory captured or enemies defeated, but in the simple proof that ordinary people can endure extraordinary circumstances and emerge with their humanity intact. Their understanding deepened, and their appreciation for peace transformed into something as precious and fragile as the tropical dawn that would soon paint the eastern horizon in shades of hope and remembrance.